All right. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the V2V thematic webinar. My name is Derek Armitage, and the Faculty Environment of the University of Waterloo, and also representing the V2V Global Partnership. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I just want to offer a few comments on the V2V project and the thematic webinar series. So the V2V Global Partnership is a research, knowledge, and action network with over 100 members from across Africa, Asia, Canada, and internationally as well. The goal of the V2V Global Partnership is to support small-scale fisheries in their transition from vulnerability to viability. And we focus on four main aspects in doing so. The first is to co-create and co-produce knowledge about small-scale fisheries. The second is to develop information systems to support our understanding of small-scale fisheries. Third is to develop transdisciplinary capacity in support of the vulnerability to viability transition of small-scale fisheries. And the fourth is to synthesize, integrate, and to mobilize knowledge for policy and impact. We conduct community-engaged research in 6 countries in Africa. That includes Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria, Tanzania, Malawi, and South Africa, and 6 countries in Asia, which include Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, Thailand, India, and Bangladesh. And in doing so, the V2V project is bringing many people together to build an understanding of small-scale fisheries transitions. Now, the V2V webinar series is one initiative that we engage in, and the aim is to generate ideas and conversation in relation to the vulnerability and viability of small-scale fisheries. Our goal is to feature researchers and academics, government and policy individuals, and NGOs who are all making a contribution to the theory and the practice and the policy of small-scale fisheries around the world. The webinar takes place on the last Friday of every month and will continue to do so through 2024. The series is available via live stream through YouTube, and details on past and future webinars, along with many other great resources, are available at the V2V website, www.v2vglobalpartnership.org. Now, today is the first seminar of 2024, and so it's really a great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Simron Singh. So Professor Singh is a faculty member in the faculty environment at the University of Waterloo, and also a university research chair, which reflects his long-standing and high impact in the research world. His research partnerships span island nations in the Caribbean and Mediterranean and Asia-Pacific regions, and he's been engaged in many international and global networks. He's the founder and lead of the research program on Metabolism of Islands, and he's also the executive secretary of the International Society for Industrial Ecology. And he chairs the inaugural board of Island Industrial Ecology within the ISIE. He also co-chairs RISCAN, and that's a global research and action network of Future Earth, along with involvement in a series of other global initiatives, including the Integrated Research on Disaster Risk, the World Weather Research Program, and the World Climate Research Program. So many, many important international activities. He's also published, of course, widely and has been a key member of our V2V community and initiative, including really important roles in developing our information system process. So it's really a wonderful opportunity for us to have Professor Singh join us today. So I really look forward to your talk, which is going to be on food and nutrition insecurity in the Caribbean, perspectives from your socio-metabolic research. So Simron, thank you very much for joining us. And I'm happy to turn it over to you, and we can share your slides and you can get going. And we will, of course, have lots of opportunity afterwards for questions. So I encourage everyone who's joined us to please include your questions in the chat, and we will get to as many as we can. So Simron, over to you.
Thank you, Derek. Thanks a lot for this kind introduction. And it's a pleasure for me to be here at this webinar. And I will share my screen so we can start presenting. So I hope my slides are visible now.
Yep, they are.
Great, thank you. So as Derek already mentioned the title, and it is kind of right here. So I will be talking about food and nutrition insecurity in the Caribbean. from the perspective of socio-metabolic research, which is the approach that I take in my work, and I'll be presenting work from several members of our team as well, that has been conducted in the Caribbean. So the brief outline of today's talk would be, first, I would like to clarify some of the concepts. Some of you may be aware, but others may not be aware of the metabolic approach. So I will introduce the concept of island metabolism, what is socio-metabolic research, and socio-metabolic risk. Then I would present some examples from the Caribbean, in particular Barbados, Dominica, Grenada, and Jamaica. And then we will look at the situation from COVID-20, from COVID-19, how that impacted the Caribbean food and nutrition security. So in tightly coupled socio-ecological systems like islands, small kind of events can be quite big, because islands are small and remote by the geographies, and so small events can also set in motion a series of cascading impacts. So what happens is that there are multiple risks that can be connected and amplified through a lot of unpleasant loops. And so tipping points can be reached very, very rapidly on islands. So they essentially become sites of multi-hazard risks and cascades. So cascades are situations where one risk and one impact can be transmitted to other sectors, to other areas rather quickly, and to other communities. And here is an example of an article, if you'd like to go to read about the cascading effects of climate change on recreational marine flat fishes and fisheries. It was published not too long ago. So that said, islands are facing an existential crisis. You would have heard, many of you, in the news during the international climate negotiations. The SIDS, the Small Island Developing States, are a very strong group, and they're forcefully negotiating their situation because they are the least responsible for climate change, and they are the most impacted from climate change through extreme weather events like sea level rise, hurricanes, cyclones. Every few days you hear about some extreme event happening on SIDS. And along with that, because of their small size and because of often being remote, they also have a resource security issue. So they are limited by by resource supplies, and they also have a reduced waste absorption capacity. So it is not easy to transport waste out of the island. It's costly, and also limited space on the island creates a challenge, a competition for land that has to be used for multiple purposes, and so landfills are quite quickly at capacity. There are also limited means to develop economies of scale because usually these populations are small, about 100,000, 150,000. We're talking about SIDS, small island developing states. And so they have difficulties to have their own production of consumer goods because it's much cheaper to import from outside than to produce your own consumer goods. So they are very dependent on imports, even to meet basic needs like food, energy. Most of the energy is coming from outside. A lot of food comes from outside, and also materials for infrastructure. They have oftentimes undiversified exports, so relying on a single economy like tourism, or export of a certain type of crops like sugarcane or superfoods that are very expensive in the industrial world. And as I already mentioned, they are very vulnerable from the climate change impacts and extreme events that follows. When this happens, the entire country pretty much shuts down. It's not the fact that there is a part of the island that is affected, but the other keeps running normally. If there is an extreme event, the entire country pretty much shuts down, and the damage to infrastructure results in loss of critical services oftentimes no electricity for long periods. The universities can shut down, every other service can be put to a halt. And what is left is a large amount of debris. So we also call it kind of a disaster waste that has to be managed and that has to be somehow disposed of properly. And then in order to restore these services, to reconstruct, it comes with a huge price, both kind of economic costs and also material requirements. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the construction materials are coming from outside in the Caribbean. So they often do not have the resources also, so they must take loans from the World Bank or some countries that can be problematic because they often come with some kind of conditions. So there is huge debt in the Caribbean, and this is oftentimes because of reconstruction that must be done after an extreme event. So I study island sustainability from a socio-metabolic perspective. So what is a socio-metabolic perspective? So I'm using islands as an organism analogy, meaning that I look at islands as a living being, living organism. And I'll give you an example here is like let's say a cow here, like a living organism that depends on resources, and the cow will graze, grass, biomass, take water in, and it'll consume and it'll also produce waste. So that's how a system would look like. This is a metabolic system, in a living organism. So similarly, islands also organize metabolic flows. So they will extract materials and energy from their domestic environment, from within the national territories, and also import from other countries from far away. So then at the end, they have some probably exports, they have waste. And interestingly, only about like 25% of the inflows become outflows within a year. A lot of it stays actually on the islands or in the socioeconomic system to become stocks. When I'm saying stocks, I'm referring to infrastructure, the built environment. So that would be roads, for example. That would be, any transport infrastructure, could be houses, could be university, could be hospitals, could be, waste management facilities. So any infrastructure that is built to provide services to society, we refer in the language of socio-metabolic research, we refer to them as material stocks. And these stocks are created to provide critical services to society, as I just mentioned. And so this is a kind of a heuristic model or a graphic to show how a material stock and flow system would look like on an island. So you see there's an island here, and then there is a huge arrow that comes from the left that shows imports. There is domestic extraction. So on the left side, so these are all inputs to the system. And then these inputs, some of it becomes material stocks in the middle, as you see, to provide services, and then there are exports and there is waste. So we can say that socio-metabolic flows create, operate, and maintain society's material stocks to provide critical services. To put it very simply, I like to show this picture because it explains in very simple ways the metabolic process. So there is an input, there is a put, and there is an output. So I will not go into the details of all of those because of time. I'll certainly want to focus on one type of materials, which is to do with food, that is biomass. But to wrap up the concept, to wrap up the concept part, I'd like to state that unsustainable patterns of resource use or island metabolism can jeopardize system resilience. So, and that leads to what I call a socio-metabolic risk. So imagine like human bodies, I mean, if we have let's say, a bad metabolism or bad lifestyle. If we have a poor, if you're consuming bad quality food, we're not eating on time, and we're not consuming enough nutrition, calories. If you go to a doctor, the doctor can, through certain tests, can actually warn you that that your lifestyle, your metabolism is very, very poor, and therefore you are at risk in the future unless you change your metabolism soon. So these risks could be in future kind of diseases, could be certain heart, you're gonna have a heart attack if you're consuming too much fat. So there could be different health problems in the future, and so those risks are being accumulated over time by a poor metabolism. So on islands, we can say that the socio-metabolic risks islands are just like circulatory health problems to humans. So they constrain the entity's ability to withstand significant shocks and changes. So what I mean by this is that if we have a poor metabolism ourselves, we are more vulnerable to falling sick. We can catch cold quickly. We can be not as resilient to viruses, and also future health problems can show up based on our poor lifestyle and poor metabolism. So we can say on islands this would be maladaptive and climate insensitive development practices. So for example, if there is coastal squeeze, so a lot of infrastructure, a lot of development happens along the coast, so that puts the system at risk due to when there's an extreme event. There's a high import dependency is also a problem because there can be disruptions in supply chains. And oftentimes you have centralized energy systems, so that when there is a cyclone or hurricane, if that one facility is destroyed, or if you're relying on fossil fuel imports, and if your fossil fuel is stored at the port in the tankers, and then with extreme events, if they are damaged, then you are out of energy supply, out of electricity for a long period of time. Apart from the fact that there will be a lot of oil spill and other types of cascade effects. So all of these kind of examples that are here, they magnify islands' climate vulnerability. So in our work, we have seen that when there are climate-related extreme events, as I mentioned, but also can be pandemics, can be other disasters, wars. They can expose the inherent vulnerabilities in the system, and kind of arising out of unsustainable resource use patterns or unsustainable metabolism. So this figure shows you a trend saying over time, if an island changes the metabolism to unsustainable means, building too much stocks, relying on too much imports, and going through a lot of maladaptive, climate insensitive development, they can reach tipping points rather quickly. So you see here the inflows, outflows, and the emissions kind of related to that. And the system could lead to a metabolic collapse. So what do I do? I am the founder and the lead of the research group, which is called Metabolism of Islands. There's also a website by this name. If you Google metabolismofislands.org. And the kind of work I do is, and with my team, is to monitor economy-wide resource use and demand from entry to exit. So we look at the resource flows, and when I'm talking about resources, we look at pretty much all resources like biomass, looking at the food system, looking at energy flows, material flows. We also look at construction materials that come in, different types of metals, ores for construction. I'm also more and more looking at water metabolism now. So we're looking at these flows from entry to exit. And then we try to look at the stock flow combinations. So how much of the flows are ending up becoming, a built environment or slash, stocks, what's the quantity, the quality, what's the distribution of the stock and flow on the island that contribute to the system's proliferation of socio-metabolic risk. We also look at the potential for socio-metabolic collapse from certain practices, and so how far the system is from tipping points and what kind of cascades that could result in. From a solution side, looking at strategies from linear to circular metabolism and how a system can become more resource efficient, adaptive, and resilient. In other words, how can island metabolism be leveraged to move to more sustainable resource use patterns to build resilience. And we're also interested to see the relationship between stock flow and service, because at the end, we mobilize flows to build stocks to provide services to society. So we are interested in focusing on the services. So how can we provide a high quality of life, high quality of services at the lowest environmental impact? So now I want to move to the second part of this talk and give you a few examples of the state of food and nutritional insecurity in the Caribbean. So the works I'm going to present are from my colleagues, my team, and you can read more about these works because we have the source mentioned at the bottom of the slides. So this one study done by some of us was looking at the biomass flows from 1961 to like 2018, so pretty much, along, several decades. And we found that Caribbean imports 83% of its food requirements. This is in monetary terms. And here is a physical trade balance of the biomass flows. So what a physical trade balance shows is that whether the system is a net importer or exporter of a certain resource. So the line in the middle that you say that's zero, so that would be like when you have no import and no export, so that's zero. But when you see the trends, below the zero, so in the early years, as you can see, from up until the 1970s, you see that these colors, yellow, yellow, gray, orange, blue. So these are representing different countries, and here we are showing you the results from Barbados, Dominica, Grenada, and Jamaica. You see that up until the 1970s, these countries were net exporters of food. So they were exporting. So when you see the trends below the zero, means that they have a resource surplus. So they are so they were exporting food. But then things changed. There were changes in policy, trade agreements around 1970s, and you see that these countries kind of transitioned very quickly to become net food importers. So from being food secure, from being food self-reliant, they have become dependent on food imports from long distances. So let me show you some results, like break it down by the countries. And I will start with Barbados. So you will see similar trends as we have seen for the overall. So here you see Barbados in 1991 becomes a net importer, especially in crop commodities. So you will see crop as being the main commodity of import in the food system in these countries. So that's represented by the blue line. But you also see that they're importing, also livestock here. And also fish. Imagine, Barbados and all these countries are actually island economies, but there is also a small amount of fish in the sense that, so this shows a difference between import export. So this is the net, so that's a net import. So they are importing more fish than what they're exporting. So you see this picture with Dominica. So Dominica remained a net exporter of food crops for a pretty much longer time than the other countries we have analyzed. So, but in the last decade or so, you will see that they also have become a net food importer, and mainly crops, but also a lot of livestock. So the green, that's represented in green. So you see that that they have been importing livestock and crop in the last decade. and that is increasing as well. The picture of Grenada looks very similar to Barbados, so they also transition a little later than Barbados, but you will see they're also net, food importers, like mainly crops, and a lot of livestock, which is the blue and the green lines. So Jamaica, similar, is a net food importer with crops, and also small amounts of other commodities as well. So there was a decrease in crop exports, and the export of their biomass commodities has also been declining. So first they were exporting, and now they are kind of importing, and that trend is increasing into for imports. So this is a study done by Sonnefeld and some other authors, and was published by FAO very kind of recently. And I'm going to show you some results from that study that was published in 2021. And we'll see, so according to FAO, there are 8 food groups are required for a healthy diet, and you can see them. There are staples: milk, meat, fish, then you have legumes, fruits, vegetables, fats and oils, and then you have sugars. So the colors here represent that if you are more in the reddish or the orange side, then you do have less of those food groups there. So if you see red, then only 3 out of the 8 food groups are available in that country. And we see, I mean, the map is a bit squeezed, but on the right side, you will see quite a few small island states are red, orange. Just a few of them are more on the green side. That's St. Lucia, Cuba, Jamaica. But the majority are actually more on the red orange side, which means that they have food groups, let's say between 3 to 5 food groups out of the 8, and you require 8 for a healthy diet. And that leads to also micronutrient deficiency. Here we see a map where we can see that the yellow is okay, but the more we move towards a more orange and red, you see that this is high levels of micronutrient deficiency. So it becomes very high to high, and some of them are moderate to deficient. So here is some of the I would summarize some of the findings here from this report in 2021, saying that 10% of SIDS, and SIDS is small island developing states, as I mentioned earlier, but this is not only the Caribbean, but they're referring to all the SIDS, but only 10% have enough iodine, and only 13% of the countries have an availability of vitamin A that is higher than the recommended daily allowance levels, and 33% meet the IRDR requirements of vitamin K. So interestingly, they are deficient in some of those micronutrients critically, but at the same time, they also found that in terms of sweets and fats, the RD levels had exceeded. So there were higher consumption of unhealthy food in terms of sweets and fats. So this is an acute issue when I say that that they are 68% of the SIDS population is food insecure, when we say the global average is 28%. So 28% of the global population would be, on an average, would be food insecure, while on the island states is 68% of the population, which is really serious. And on an average, the SIDS are importing 60% of the food requirements. And Caribbean is importing 83% of their food in dollar value, but also overall in their volume as well. And smallholder farmers are facing a lot of challenges on islands because they are competing with cheaper food imports that come from the mainland, because they do not have the economies of scale, They cannot produce in quantities, and also the economic costs are higher if you produced on the island because of lack of the industrial infrastructure. So it's an economy of scale issue. And also the per capita arable land in the Caribbean small states is about half that of the least developed countries. So it is 0.1 hectare per capita. So you see that even the land availability that is for agriculture per person per capita is much lower than anywhere else. And and the problem is further compounded when they're exposed to shocks like climate impacts, but also pandemics. And now I will move to my example of the COVID. So I'm going to show you some results from a survey that was done in 5 points of time from 2020 to 2022. And so this is a survey where they were collecting data in 5 points of time. So April 2020, June 2020, February 21, February 22, and August 2022. And they were kind of having respondents that were over 25,000 people, and 70% of those were females. And you can see the average household size was 4, and average age is around 41. So this was a Caribbean food security and livelihood survey. Um, and so I will show you some of the results, not all of them, but just to highlight the problem that they faced. So when you see these different colors, different bars, they're representing different points in time. And the one on the left, the blue, is the most recent point in time, August 2022. And the one on the very right bar, you see, is April 20. So as you see, as the pandemic progressed over these couple of years, respondents who were reporting an increase in food prices over the past 2 weeks when the survey was taken was increasing. So by August 2022, nearly everyone was reporting increase in food prices. And the other graph is kind of also kind of stating similar patterns. Here you see below is the question was, which statement best reflects your food situation over the past 7 days? So if you look at the kind of dark sections, so not the gray ones, but the blue, the dark blue and the light blue, these are problematic. So you will see from April 20, which is at the bottom, and as the pandemic progressed and you move upwards to August 2022, you will see that the dark zones are increasing, which means that these are people who commented that I ate less preferred foods, or I skipped meals or ate less than usual, or I went whole day without eating. So this is quite critical that you see by August 2022, almost 70% of the people were reporting one of these statements. So this was a question asking for the was there a time in the past 30 days when you experienced the following? So you will see that, so I'll just highlight a few of those. So you can see that about 40% of the population was saying I was hungry but did not eat. That was in 2022. More than 40% were reporting that my household ran out of food. And more than 60% of the population surveyed was saying I was unable to eat healthy and nutritious food. So what are the main worries? And you can see right on top for different periods, inability to cover food needs is the highest, the main worry among the other worries that are listed, as you can see below. So fear of illness was a lower worry than the inability to cover food needs, which half of the population was reporting as the main worry. So in terms of different like food groups, so this is a study that was done by Dali and some some colleagues, and this was published in 2022, and they were looking at how different groups in the agri-food system in the Caribbean were experiencing the COVID-19. So these 4 groups are the farmers, then that is in blue, and the B is the food distributors, the C is the food service operators, and D are the consumers. So let's see how they were reporting the different groups. So on the top left, the blue are the farmers. So they're reporting, the percentage reporting loss of income was the highest, inability to acquire seeds. So if seeds are, coming from long distances, so when you have a problem in supply chain, so you are unable to get seed and also to grow the food. So there's a loss of markets and increased price of the inputs, and so you will see that the lack of shortage of labor, and so that's the farmer group. And then if you look at the green, then this is the food distributors. They had lower sales and they had insufficient, unsistent supply. And then for the C, the food service operators, for the most part, like more than 80% were saying the business is closed down, basically. And then if you look at the consumers, they had big challenges in terms of mobility, so they were not able to go and secure food because of lockdowns. And there were also health and safety concerns because of what they could consume, what was safe. So there were main issues, and the food businesses had also closed. So these consumers were facing also, challenges. So you can see these groups, they're part of the agri-food system and how that was impacted by different groups. So what are the challenges and barriers to food and nutrition security in the Caribbean? And I want to show you a couple of slides from our team. And again, the reference is at the bottom. If you would like to read more, this was a scoping review. You can see that we are identifying here some of the direct policy deficiency on the left, and then the institutional constraints on the right. So the policy issues were lack of cooperation and holistic approaches, the top-down government initiatives, inefficiency in addressing vulnerability to shocks, and inequities in policies and practices. On the institutional side, you see on the right is that there was kind of knowledge issues, there was insufficient infrastructure, issues around human capital, and administrative obstacles. And if we were to rank these in terms of their main, like which are the main barriers, if you were to combine all of those and rank them, then you see that inefficiency in addressing vulnerability to shocks was ranked the highest. And that was tied with the lack of cooperation and holistic approaches. So you can see the lack of the systemic approaches and cooperation as a region, as a community, and also the ineffectiveness to address shocks were really ranked as the main problems, the main challenges that are barriers to food and nutrition security in the Caribbean. So what's the solution? And the same study done by a group identified that polycentric governance should be promoted as a solution. And there are some of those points here. The decision-making centers should exist at different levels. The need to engage several institutions. Also looking at decision-making with which are consistent with spatial boundaries where the issues are. Also look at rules, norms, incentives, restrictions, structures. So kind of relook at some of those structures. Also to introduce not only formal but informal settings for conflict resolution, and SIDS overall to have more collaboration to discuss and to introduce some of the deliberation and learning mechanisms from each other. So that kind of summarized very much my talk, and here are some key resources and suggested readings. I've already been referring to those in the slides, but they are right here at the end. So in case you wanted to go deeper in some of those issues. So with that, I will conclude my talk. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Simron. That was really interesting and a series of lessons, actually, I think, from the perspective of transitioning from vulnerability to viability in the context of our project as well. Not the least of which, from my perspective, is just the reminder of the importance of a systems perspective on these things. The cross-scale feedbacks that you talked about and how that plays out in fisheries as well, the tipping points and the thresholds ideas. And I think also a reminder of how important fisheries are from a nutrient perspective in the region as well, right? And so the importance of supporting small-scale fisheries in the context of food security issues generally within the region. Because during COVID, of course, small-scale fishers also experienced some of those supply chain challenges and shocks to the market as well. So really great stuff. Lots of parallels and alignments between your research and sort of how we've been all thinking about the transition from vulnerability to viability in small-scale fisheries as well. So that's great. We have some time here for a few questions. I encourage people to include some questions in the chat. And I think we have a couple of those that are coming in as well. Maybe just while we get while those questions roll in, maybe I might just start with one as well. And it goes back to some of the systems ideas and the concepts that you've highlighted. And I think the idea of this notion of a tightly coupled system and how that plays out in these different ways. It's a reminder for me again that, small scale fisheries are also these tightly coupled systems. We can think about them at different scales, but they're full of, feedback loops and things like that. And so this notion that you were talking about at the beginning in terms of coupled systems and tipping points and things like that, how are you seeing sort of the ecological tipping points within that metabolic kind of perspective and social tipping points as being related, or are they two different things? Are they connected in some particular ways that help us understand this idea of thresholds and tipping points and things like that? So it's just more of an open-ended question about this concept and the relationship between the ecological and the social dimensions of tipping points.
Sure. Yes, they can certainly be connected, and they can play out very rapidly on small islands. Let me give you an example of a Greek island that we have been studying for over a decade. And this is what happened was that this is the island of Samothrace, which is in the Aegean Sea, and some time ago the EU introduced subsidies for the livestock. So they said, okay, when you have goats, you have livestock, we will pay you in order to support the EU farmers. We'll pay you certain amount per head. And so there was this incentive to grow the numbers of goats just for the subsidies, even if these were not very productive animals. So you saw suddenly the numbers increased, and they went 3 times, and they carrying capacity 80,000 goats. They were not used often for meat or milk, but the subsidies were driving the increase in the goat numbers. And we know that goats, when they graze, they can cause a lot of overgrazing. So so the overgrazing, digging into the soil, and so the island started to face serious soil erosion at the edges, everywhere. So the island was pretty much eaten up. And when rain was coming, a lot of soil was being washed. And as with islands, they're experiencing a lot of flash floods as well. So there were these kind of flooding situations where a lot of soil was just going into the oceans. So what we experienced here by one intervention, it was meant in a good way to support the farmers, but that cascaded into an ecological tipping point, which meant that there was huge amount of soil loss, and that was washed into the oceans. That affected the marine system around. So it affected the fisher communities. So that is a livelihood system, and that we have observed ourselves very, very closely. So overgrazing can be over competing land uses, or when there is a lot of soil sealing. So another tipping point is that many islands are building up infrastructure for tourism, so there's a lot of soil sealing. So what happens is you're reducing the surface area for water to go and capture into the hydrological system. So that is one issue you reduce. So that means that you're affecting the ecological system again, the water system, by changing land use. And when there are flash floods, which are happening because the frequency, the intensity of rain is increasing because there are periods of droughts versus these flash floods. So water is not falling evenly in the year anymore. There is all these very extreme situations. And when this happens, when you have flash floods, what happens is there's a lot huge water runoff, and they don't get captured into the system, so they just get washed away along with a lot of debris, a lot of kind of harmful nutrients that is not good for the ocean. So again, impacting the surrounding marine system. So that's an example of how social activities can impact the ecological system. But in terms of social tipping points, an example could be is if you shut down the university, let's say, the government thinks that, okay, we can't afford a university, it's just too costly or whatever, or there is already, out migration, and because of that, it's becoming difficult to maintain certain healthcare, certain types of health services that are costly. Like, kind of Maldives now, depends currently on certain types of health services from India. And so they have to get certain treatments. But if the island, island government decides to shut off a university, then you will often find young people leaving the island for getting higher education to study elsewhere. So there is outmigration, which reduces the population even more, and there is a potential brain drain because these people often won't come back. So they get settled elsewhere because they have studied, got exposure somewhere. Similarly, for health services, if you shut down services for elderly, then you find people like aging population can leave as well, so they will go join some because so it changes the demographics, and that leads to a cascade situation where one thing, then it reduces even more budgets, then you cut down another sector, because the less population they're paying taxes, it's also meaning less revenue for the governments, and that means less resources they have to invest in other industries unless they take loans. So it becomes a cascade. And so one change can lead to many other kind of, say kind of changes in the system, leading to a tipping point that can be problematic.
Yeah, and those are really, really helpful examples and grounded examples from these different contexts. And also the speed with which those cascading effects start to take place can increase as well, right? So yeah, and also you're highlighting the unintended effects of particular policies is really, really crucial in how we think about these tipping points. So that's great. Okay, we have some other questions coming in, so I want to try and get to those. We have a question from Fluke Ariola. Yeah, so the increase in development on islands, like population and infrastructure, has led to more imports and vulnerabilities. So, and this is a natural question of what are the strategies that can be used to address or reverse some of these trends? If you can reflect on that a little bit.
So again, I would emphasize the systems approach. So I can speak on a very general level, but when we are looking at solutions for change on islands, we are looking at it very specifically, what the issues are on that particular island, what the conditions are, the context, what system is interacting with what, because different islands are in proximity to different world regions, so they have different agreements. Like in the Caribbean, have more relation to North America and Europe, while islands in the Indian Ocean will have more contact to the Asian mainland, and also the Pacific Island will have to Australia and New Zealand. So that will influence also what the issues are and the solutions. But generally speaking, to this question is that um, um, I would say that infrastructure, to me, a big leverage is how infrastructure is being developed, what kind of infrastructure is being created, and why it's being created, because oftentimes the countries we have been looking at, a lot of infrastructure is built for tourists, so they're not used for local population for the whole year, but they're used for a certain months only, which is a peak tourist season. And a lot of infrastructure, I can show you pictures, kind of satellite. In 50 years, how an island was transformed from almost no infrastructure to complete built environment, like, huge, like concrete mass. And the more infrastructure you build, the more flows you need. So there's a system. So there is a stock and flow dynamics here. So typically when you're building infrastructure, you're getting into a locked-in situation for around 70 years, unless there is a catastrophe and everything is damaged. But then hopefully you won't build it the same way. But assuming that nothing really happens, you're locked in for 70 years. And more the stocks, the more the flows you need. So you need to organize some of the materials constantly. That's costly. Um, um, so optimizing infrastructure use, which is more beneficial to the local population, providing the critical services local needs, to me is the highest kind of leverage. That would be one. The spatial distribution of infrastructure is very important for islands. So there is a huge tendency to build around the coast, because of tourist like resorts and infrastructure because of tourism. So you see this coastal squeeze, which is also very, very risky. And so the spatial distribution, there are ecological sensitive areas where you should avoid building because there's conflict. Oftentimes when permission shouldn't be granted, but they're granted to build in ecological sensitivity areas, which because it's beautiful, it's very nice, or and so it could be attractive. And then you're also doing soil sealing there. So spatial distribution becomes very important. Landfills, where you locate the landfills and how they are managed, because waste is an important issue. Islands generate more waste than global average. So, and this has been done in many studies, including our studies. So you have higher amounts of waste because of, a lot of course, tourists, but also when you import a lot of stuff, it comes with packaging. So a lot of packaging is coming. So a lot of materials that are undesired for an island ecology. So we are looking at the problem from the input side, from the put side, that is infrastructure, and we're looking at the problem from the output side. So this is a system. And so to look for solutions, we have to understand these this whole interconnectedness of input, put, and output. And I usually start in my work, I start with the put. Is what kind of development is happening on the island, what kind of policy, what kind of infrastructure has been built, because the put determines the input and the output.
Hmm.
So that's how I like to see it. That's on the biophysical side, my response. My other response is more on capacity strengthening on the islands. So what is happening, the issue of brain drain that I mentioned, a lot of education, island universities, when I look at curriculums, there is a strong bias towards certain type of training and education that supports brain drain, meaning the kind of education training that gets you jobs overseas, that you can leave the country. So I have been working with our partners to influence, to introduce, certain curriculums on islands that are training local populations about island issues and solving their own problems, rather than having their own people leave to do jobs elsewhere and have, on the other hand, consultants, coming in paid expensive consultants to solve island problems, which I'm not even sure if they are able to do that effectively.
Right.
So those are things, I think, areas that I see on a very high level. But again, I said, for every island, when we analyze, we look at very specific cases.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. And that last point you made about the curriculum is actually a nice segue to another question from Amit Lahiri. He says, a question for Professor Singh. What is striking is why the governments of SIDS, realizing the rising food insecurity over decades, haven't been able to take any remedial steps, it seems like. So how empowered is civil society? And maybe there's a connection there to this capacity issue you were just talking about.
So, when you get, so there's a word we use called metabolic trap, So I've used this term in different ways: socio-metabolic risk, socio-metabolic trap. socio-metabolic collapse. So here now the question is around the socio-metabolic trap. So when we saw that, the Caribbean, in this case, they were the net food exporters, but around the 70s, it was very attractive, when the island governments were at that time very attractive to negotiate, okay, why do we need to grow our own food? It's easier, cheaper to get from outside. And, I mean, there is a short-term thinking in politics. So it is more beneficial. Let's do, and we can, yes, it's a great idea. Let's move our land use and our population to tourism, to IT or certain other sectors that are more profitable. We can just reduce our agriculture to superfoods like avocados or mangoes or, certain types of which are you can export, which are desired in North America and Europe. So change land use system. So what they do is it's the short-term thinking happens often in any system, not only islands, is that can get you. It looks very attractive in the short term. Suddenly you have a variety of food that you wouldn't grow locally, and supermarkets are flooded and cheaper, and then you see this part dependency. You get into this trap, and over time, your own agriculture system would collapses, right? So once you move with that policy, then there's a cascade, there's an impact to other sectors. So the sector collapses. So the food production, the agri-food system collapses locally, which means over a few decades, they don't now have the capacity to do their own food. The farmers, they were there, they're old, the children do not want to, very few children want to do farming because many children then move to other sectors. So I was visiting these islands, talking to farmers, and the old farmers' main concern was who will do farming after us? And their children don't see any benefit. So suddenly there's a loss of capacity in farming too. The knowledge is gone, the investments are not there, the infrastructure is not there because the system has been compromised, has collapsed. Now the governments are realizing. So since now when they have faced shocks with climate and with pandemic, there is a concern. There is a serious concern at the moment about food security. So they are realizing, but you cannot change that overnight. Even if you realize today to transform the system, you have to get people, you have to make changes in policy with land use, you have to provide incentives. I was you have to start putting resources in that sector. But it again, so as I said, stocks, so it's a stock, Once a stock is destroyed, sector collapses, it takes time to build a stock. So that is again a stock and flow problem. So even if you decide today to move from 2 children to 1 children, you're going to have to, let's say, to have 1 child, the result of the demographic shift you will only see in 20 years, right? So even if you change a policy today, the result you will see in a long time. But the policy has to be sustained and has to be consequent, and there has to be seriousness. So there is concern, but systems don't change so rapidly because there is a delay, as we know. Even if you start to make changes today, you will see results in the future.
So yeah, absolutely. So maybe one or two final questions here, but one of those it relates kind of to the solution scape that you're talking about and how governments are responding, and it kind of connects back to this idea of polycentric governance that you raised. And in my mind, there's a little bit of an issue around the agency of governments to affect some change in terms of this metabolic traps or collapse. Be part of that transition, to my understanding, from being, food exporters to importers in the 70s and 80s was very much about IMF policy, World Bank packages that really constrain the ability of governments to set and make decisions. And I'm wondering what's the relationship sort of between current institutional frameworks and governance arrangements, whether that's at the national or sort of broader global scale, and these efforts to take action to reduce this metabolic risk that you're talking about, and how polycentric governance kind of fits into that sort of broader context.
Yeah, the issue of agency is important. We have seen especially small nations, small island nations, small nations, we have seen trends where they lose the agency and they get more integrated into the global system, and into the global trade arrangements, global negotiations, And then you get into a locked-in situation, it seems attractive at that time, or probably there's coercion, maybe there is pressure because of loans, and these are conditional aid that will give you the money to rebuild, but then you need to open up, change some trade arrangements and structural these kind of changes in the structure, economic and the economic system. So sometimes they can be pressure, sometimes they can be attractive, there are multiple reasons, but over time, small island nations have been losing sovereignty over many of those decisions, and it's a trap. It's another type of trap. But that is not only with island nations, smaller nations, but many countries in the so-called developing South. They face very similar issues. They are so this is a real issue. But the opportunity, what I see here is that island states, they are about a quarter of the UN membership, right? It's we're around 200. We have about 200 countries in the UN, and about 30 plus are SIDS, and then there are small island states. And if you count, there are around 50 small island states, whether developing or not. They're a quarter of the UN membership, so they have a voice. If they wanted to collaborate, they could. They are becoming a strong voice in the COP negotiations. They're organized to speak to those issues of the loss and damage. There's a talk about those, about sovereignty, about building more resilience. This is a huge topic that has been growing. Almost a tenth of the world's population live on islands, and we may not. So this is a big population, you see, almost a tenth. And they are, if I remember correctly, they are using about a sixth of the Earth's surface and oceans. So that island populations live and depend on, because you're calling the economic zones also the oceans. So they are more and more calling not as small island states, but they're calling themselves as large ocean states, right? So this shift in thinking from small island states to large ocean states, which is a very different, it's not just semantics, it just hits you. Oh my God, there's so much ocean to control. So think of the population, that is almost a tenth. Think of the UN membership. Think of the large ocean states. If you all put this collectively, I think there is an opportunity for island nations to collaborate, work together, and make a transformation, to have agency, to put in your words, to transform and become more food secure and resource secure.
Yeah, great. Really interesting sort of reminder about the impact and scope and scale of island states in terms of this political landscape also. Okay, well, I'm looking at our time, and there are a couple other questions that have been coming up in relation to the things we've been talking about, which is really great. I just want to say thank you very much, Simron, for a really interesting talk and a series of ideas that I think we can also use in the context of our ongoing discussions about V2V transitions and what they mean and how we understand them in particular. And you've alluded to a series of sort of policy levers also that I think are really relevant for us to have continuing conversations on those. So I just want to thank you again for taking the time to provide the seminar today and the conversation today. There's an opportunity for individuals to follow up with you. You've made reference to lots of great resources as well, so encourage people to seek those out. And also to stay tuned for the next thematic webinar series announcement. So for the next one in February as well. And so with that, I just again, thanks very much, Simron, and thank you everybody for joining today and for the great questions. And we look forward to seeing everybody online in about a month. So thank you.
Well, thank you everyone as well. Thank you, Derek, V2V team, and all the audience who I don't see, but I hope you have a great day, great evening, wherever you are.
Great, super. All righty, thanks very much.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.